The room smelled of kerosene and something else, something the three doctors present would later struggle to name in their testimonies. It was a parlor in a house outside Mobile, Alabama, on an evening in late September when the heat still clung to everything like a second skin. The woman on the examination table was 26 years old. Her name was Abigail Marsh, and for the past 117 minutes she had been clinically dead. Her skin held no warmth. Her chest showed no rise or fall. The mirror held beneath her nostrils collected no fog, and yet her eyes remained open, tracking the movements of the people around her with an expression that Dr. Samuel Whitcomb would describe in his journal as neither peaceful nor distressed but attentive, deeply attentive, as if she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. The clock on the mantel ticked through the silence. The doctors checked their instruments again. No pulse, no breath, no heartbeat. But awareness, consciousness without the mechanisms that should sustain it. And then, at exactly 2 hours and 1 minute, Abigail Marsh drew a breath so sharp it sounded like a scream, and her heart resumed beating with such force that Dr. Whitcomb said he could see it through her chest wall. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Marsh family arrived in southern Alabama in 1853, part of the wave of settlement that followed the Indian removals. They came from the mountains of eastern Tennessee, from a region where isolation bred peculiarities, where families developed their own ways of dealing with sickness, with death, with the hardships that killed the unprepared. Josiah Marsh, the family patriarch, purchased 300 acres of pine forest and swampland 15 miles north of Mobile. He brought with him his wife Rebecca, 4 sons, 2 daughters, and something else, something that didn't appear in any manifest or deed, but that everyone who knew the family understood was present nonetheless. A tradition, a practice, a way of managing the boundary between living and dying that other families didn't discuss and didn't understand. The neighbors who met the Marsh family in those early years noted their peculiarity. They were polite but distant, willing to trade but unwilling to socialize. They attended church irregularly and sat in the back pews when they did attend. The children were educated, but in what curriculum no one could say, because they didn't attend the local schoolhouse. And there were rumors, quiet rumors, about family members who'd been sick unto death, and then recovered in ways that seemed miraculous or impossible, depending on who was telling the story. By 1860, the Marsh family had established themselves as competent if odd additions to the community. Josiah Marsh was known as a fair dealer in timber. His sons worked hard and caused no trouble. His daughters were considered unmarriageable not because of any defect, but because of an aura that surrounded them, a sense that they were separate somehow, that they belonged to systems of obligation that outsiders couldn't penetrate. The Civil War came and went. 2 of the Marsh sons fought for the Confederacy. One returned. The other was listed as missing after Shiloh, though a letter from a fellow soldier claimed he'd seen the boy after he'd been shot through the chest, seen him lying in a field hospital, no pulse, no breath, presumed dead, and then 3 hours later walking among the wounded as if nothing had happened. The letter writer attributed this to battlefield confusion, to the chaos of war making reliable observation impossible. But he noted that other soldiers had witnessed the same thing, that there was talk among the survivors of the Marsh boy who couldn't be killed, who died and undied and walked away. Abigail Marsh was born in 1846, the youngest of Josiah's children. Her mother Rebecca died in childbirth, which was common enough not to raise comment. But the circumstances around the death were less common. Rebecca Marsh labored for 36 hours. The midwife attending her reported that Rebecca's heart stopped twice during the labor, stopped completely, each time for periods the midwife estimated at 15 to 20 minutes. Each time, Rebecca revived without intervention, without explanation, continuing the labor as if the cessation had been a brief rest rather than clinical death. The midwife, a woman named Clara Dodd who'd attended hundreds of births, later told her daughter that she'd never seen anything like it, that Rebecca Marsh had some quality that made the normal rules of dying not apply. When Abigail was finally born, Rebecca's heart stopped a third time. This time it didn't restart. The baby survived. The mother did not. Josiah Marsh buried his wife in the family plot on their property and never remarried. He raised Abigail himself, with help from his older daughters, and as the girl grew, it became apparent that she'd inherited something from her mother, something that set her apart even within a family already considered separate. Abigail's childhood was marked by incidents that the family tried to keep private, but that occasionally came to the attention of neighbors or visiting merchants. At age 7, she fell from a barn loft and landed on her head. The doctor summoned to examine her found no pulse, no respiration, pupils fixed and dilated. He pronounced her dead. Josiah asked the doctor to wait, to remain for a while before making any arrangements. The doctor, curious and somewhat disturbed by the father's calm demeanor, agreed. After 45 minutes, Abigail opened her eyes, sat up, and asked for water. The doctor examined her again and found a strong, steady heartbeat, normal breathing, no signs of injury. He documented the case in his personal records but listed the cause as misdiagnosis rather than resurrection. It was easier to believe he'd been wrong than to accept what he'd witnessed. At age 12, Abigail developed a fever that should have killed her. For 3 days she burned, delirious, until on the evening of the third day her temperature spiked so high that her skin was painful to touch. Then she went cold, completely cold. Her aunt, checking on her through the night, found her without pulse or breath at 2 in the morning. By dawn, Abigail was sitting at the breakfast table, pale but functional, asking about her lessons. The fever was gone. Whatever infection had ravaged her had been burned out or stopped, or somehow negotiated with. By the time Abigail reached adulthood, the pattern was established and recognized, at least within the family. She died and undied. The mechanisms were unclear. The reasons were unknown, but the fact was undeniable. Josiah Marsh, practical and protective, tried to keep his daughter's condition private. He restricted her interactions with outsiders. He arranged her life to minimize situations where her peculiarity might be exposed. But in 1871, Abigail met a man named Thomas Whitmore at a church social, one of the rare occasions when Josiah had allowed her to attend a community gathering. Thomas was a surveyor, educated from a respectable Mobile family, and he was immediately taken with Abigail. She was beautiful in a way that transcended conventional prettiness, her features sharp and memorable, her bearing suggesting depths of experience that shouldn't have been possible for a woman of 25 who'd lived such a sheltered life. Thomas courted her with Josiah's reluctant permission. Josiah warned Thomas that Abigail was different, that her health was delicate in unusual ways, that marriage to her would require understanding and discretion. Thomas, young and in love, assured Josiah he could handle any difficulty. He had no idea what he was promising. The wedding took place in April of 1872. It was a small ceremony, immediate family only, held at the Marsh property rather than in a church. Thomas's family attended but found the whole affair peculiar, the Marshes too quiet, too watchful, as if waiting for something to go wrong. The marriage seemed happy at first. Thomas and Abigail moved into a house in Mobile proper, a compromise that allowed Abigail some distance from her family while keeping her close enough that help could reach her quickly if needed. Thomas returned to his surveying work. Abigail managed their household. For 5 months, everything was normal. Then came September, and with it, the incident that would make Abigail Marsh Whitmore a subject of medical fascination and public horror. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? On the evening of September 23, 1872, Abigail collapsed in her parlor. Thomas found her on the floor, unconscious, no apparent injury or illness to explain the sudden failure. He ran for the nearest doctor, a man named Samuel Whitcomb who maintained a practice on Government Street. Dr. Whitcomb arrived within 20 minutes and found Abigail in the condition described at the beginning of this account. No pulse, no respiration, no response to stimuli. But her eyes were open and tracking. Whitcomb, a rational man trained in the latest medical techniques, assumed he was witnessing some form of catalepsy, a condition where the body's vital signs became so depressed they were undetectable by standard methods. He'd read case studies. He knew such things occurred, but the duration disturbed him. After 30 minutes with no change, he sent for two colleagues, Dr. Marcus Thorne and Dr. Benjamin Kane. They arrived and confirmed Whitcomb's observations. No heartbeat by any method of detection available to them. No breath sounds, body temperature dropping, but consciousness present, undeniable and eerie. The three doctors consulted in whispers while Thomas paced and demanded they do something, anything, to help his wife. The doctors had nothing to offer. They'd never encountered a case like this. They could only watch and wait and document. At the 1-hour mark, Dr. Thorne suggested they attempt to stimulate the heart through various means. They tried smelling salts, tried percussion, tried electrical stimulation using a primitive battery device. Nothing produced any change. Abigail remained in her state of conscious death, her eyes following them, her expression unchanging. At 90 minutes, Dr. Kane suggested they were witnessing the final stages of some neurological catastrophe, that the awareness they observed was an illusion, the random firing of a dying brain creating the appearance of consciousness. Whitcomb disagreed. He'd conducted tests. He'd asked Abigail to blink twice if she could hear him, and she had. He'd asked her to look at specific objects, and she'd tracked them perfectly. Whatever this was, it wasn't the random activity of a failing organ. At 117 minutes, with no warning, no preliminary signs, Abigail drew that sharp, gasping breath, and her heart began beating so forcefully that all three doctors startled backward. Color flooded her face. Her body temperature began rising immediately. Within 2 minutes, she was physiologically normal. Within 5 minutes, she was sitting up and apologizing for the distress she'd caused. The doctors examined her thoroughly. They found nothing wrong. Blood pressure normal, heart rhythm strong and regular, lung function perfect. It was as if the previous 2 hours had been a dream, an impossibility that left no physical trace. But they'd all witnessed it. Thomas had witnessed it, and now it had to be dealt with. Dr. Whitcomb insisted on keeping Abigail under observation. He arranged for her to stay at a private sanitarium on the outskirts of Mobile, a facility that catered to wealthy patients with nervous conditions. Thomas protested. Abigail herself was reluctant, but Whitcomb was adamant that this case needed documentation, needed study, that if Abigail had some condition that caused these episodes, understanding it might save her life in the future. Reluctantly, Abigail agreed to a 2-week observation period. It was during this period that the doctors learned the truth about the Marsh family, and what they learned fundamentally altered their understanding of what medical science could and couldn't explain. Josiah Marsh visited his daughter at the sanitarium daily. On the 5th day of her stay, Dr. Whitcomb asked Josiah directly about Abigail's history, about whether similar episodes had occurred before. Josiah, weighing his options and recognizing that the truth would eventually emerge, told Whitcomb everything. The childhood incidents, the pattern of death and revival, the family history that stretched back generations, back to the old country, to places in the Scottish Highlands where his ancestors had lived in isolation and developed practices that mixed medicine with something older, something that predated scientific understanding. Josiah described a technique taught within the family that allowed certain individuals to separate consciousness from bodily function, to enter a state he called the between, where death could be experienced without permanence, where the boundary could be crossed and recrossed as long as certain conditions were maintained. Whitcomb listened with increasing skepticism, then increasing discomfort. What Josiah described wasn't medical. It was mystical, occult, impossible. And yet Whitcomb had witnessed the impossible himself. He'd held his hand to Abigail's throat for 2 hours and felt nothing. He'd watched her die and undie. Something was operating outside the framework of his training. Dr. Whitcomb began researching historical cases of catalepsy, of apparent death, of resurrections and revivals. He found scattered references in medical literature, most dismissed as misdiagnoses or legends, but he also found patterns. Certain families appeared repeatedly in these accounts. Certain regions, particularly in the British Isles and Appalachia, seemed to produce an unusual number of cases, and the descriptions matched what he'd witnessed with Abigail: conscious death, prolonged cessation of vital signs without deterioration, sudden revival without lingering effects. Whitcomb compiled his findings into a paper he intended to present to the Mobile Medical Society. But before he could present it, Abigail had a second episode at the sanitarium, this one witnessed by nurses and orderlies and patients who would not keep quiet, who would not allow the incident to remain private. Word spread. The local newspaper heard rumors. And suddenly, Abigail Marsh Whitmore became public property, a mystery to be solved or a curiosity to be displayed. The Mobile Daily Register ran its first story on October 15, 1872. The headline read, "The Impossible Woman, Local Lady Defies Death Through Mysterious Affliction." The article described Abigail's condition in sensational terms, mixed medical speculation with supernatural insinuation, and included interviews with sanitarium staff who claimed to have witnessed her death and revival. The story was picked up by papers across the South. Within a week, Abigail was famous, and the fame was destroying her life. Thomas Whitmore, unable to handle the scrutiny and the implications of his wife's condition, filed for annulment. He claimed fraud, argued that Abigail had concealed her affliction before marriage, that he'd entered the union under false pretenses. The court, uncertain how to handle such an unusual case, granted the annulment. Abigail returned to her father's house, disgraced and exhibited, a woman whose peculiarity had made her unmarriageable and unemployable, fit only for study or spectacle. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Dr. Whitcomb, feeling responsible for Abigail's exposure, tried to protect her from the worst of the attention. He published a measured medical paper arguing that her condition was physiological rather than supernatural, that future advances in medicine would explain what current understanding couldn't. But his paper only increased interest. Medical societies across the country wrote requesting more information. Showmen wrote offering money to display Abigail in traveling exhibitions. Spiritualists claimed she was a medium, that her ability to die and return proved the existence of the soul. Religious figures argued she was possessed or cursed or blessed, depending on their theological orientation. Everyone wanted to explain Abigail. No one wanted to simply let her be. Josiah Marsh, protective and increasingly desperate, moved his family deeper into their property, away from the main road, away from visitors who arrived uninvited seeking glimpses of the woman who couldn't die. They built a new house in a clearing surrounded by pine and swamp, a place that could be defended, where privacy could be maintained. And there, in increasing isolation, Abigail lived with her father and her surviving brother, hidden from a world that wanted to dissect her mystery rather than accept it. But isolation couldn't stop the episodes. They continued with increasing frequency through the winter of 1872 and into 1873. Sometimes Abigail would go weeks without incident. Sometimes she would have multiple episodes in a single week. The pattern seemed random, triggered by nothing obvious, ending according to no predictable schedule. Josiah kept detailed records, noting the time of onset, duration, any circumstances that might be relevant. He found no consistency except in one detail. Every episode occurred during the dark of the moon, during those nights when lunar light was absent and darkness was complete. Josiah, remembering the old teachings from his own father, recognized this as significant. The between, according to family tradition, was easier to access when the barriers between worlds were thinnest, and the dark moon was when those barriers were at their most permeable. This suggested Abigail's episodes weren't random affliction but something else, something connected to cycles older than medicine, to rhythms that predated human understanding of physiology. In March of 1873, a woman arrived at the Marsh property uninvited and unannounced. She gave her name as Margaret Corvin, claimed to be a distant relative from the Tennessee mountains, family Josiah hadn't seen in decades. Margaret was in her 50s, weathered and hard, speaking with an accent so thick even Josiah struggled to follow it at first. She said she'd heard about Abigail, heard the family name mentioned in newspapers that had made their way to remote mountain communities. She'd come because she recognized what was happening, because her own family had dealt with the same condition, because she knew things that might help. Josiah, desperate and willing to try anything, invited her in. What Margaret told him over the next 3 days fundamentally changed how the Marsh family understood Abigail's affliction and their own history. Margaret explained that the condition wasn't random. It was hereditary, passing through bloodlines, appearing most strongly in women though men could carry it. It originated, according to family oral tradition, in the northern highlands of Scotland, among people who lived in regions where the boundary between the living world and the other place was thin. These people developed practices to exploit that thinness, to step partially into death for various purposes: healing, prophecy, communication with things that existed between states. The practices required training, required knowledge passed down through generations, required rituals and protections that kept the practitioner safe while they walked the between. But over centuries, as families dispersed and knowledge was lost, the ability persisted without the training. People like Abigail were born with the capacity to die and return, but without understanding how to control it, how to make it safe, how to ensure the return. Margaret said that in the old days, people with uncontrolled access to the between often didn't return. They stepped across and stayed there, lost in a state that was neither life nor death, trapped in awareness without embodiment. The fact that Abigail always returned suggested she had some instinctive protection, some unconscious knowledge that kept her tethered. But Margaret warned that instinct might not be enough, that eventually Abigail might step across and not find her way back. Josiah asked if there was a cure, a way to stop the episodes. Margaret said there was no cure because it wasn't a disease. It was a quality, like eye color or left-handedness, intrinsic to who Abigail was, but it could be managed. Margaret offered to teach Abigail the old practices, the techniques that would give her control over her transitions, that would let her choose when to cross and when to return. The training would be difficult and dangerous. It would require Abigail to deliberately induce the death state and navigate the between while conscious, learning its topography, its rules, its inhabitants. Most people who attempted this training died permanently. But without training, Abigail was at risk anyway, stumbling through a landscape she didn't understand, lucky to have survived this long. Josiah consulted with Abigail. She agreed to the training. She was tired of being victim to her own biology, tired of the fear that each episode might be the one where she didn't come back. If there was even a possibility of control, she would take it. The training began in April of 1873 and continued through the summer. Margaret took Abigail into the deep swamp behind the Marsh property, to places where cypress knees rose from black water and the air was thick with moisture and rot. She taught her techniques of breathing and meditation, ways of quieting the body while keeping the mind alert. She taught her to recognize the signs of an impending episode, the subtle shifts in perception that preceded the transition. And she taught her to navigate the between itself, describing it as a space that existed parallel to normal reality, a place where consciousness could persist without physical form, where time moved differently, where things that had never been alive waited and watched. Margaret warned Abigail that the between was inhabited, that when she crossed over she would encounter presences, entities that existed in that liminal space and that might take interest in a living consciousness passing through their realm. Some were benign, curious but harmless. Others were predatory, seeking to trap or consume any awareness they encountered. The key to survival was learning to recognize the difference, learning to move through the between without attracting attention, without leaving traces that things could follow back to the living world. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Abigail's training produced results but also consequences. She learned to induce the death state voluntarily, to cross into the between at will, to spend increasing amounts of time there before returning. But each crossing changed her in subtle ways. She became more distant, more detached from ordinary concerns. She spoke less. When she did speak, her observations had a quality that disturbed even her father, as if she were commenting on life from outside it rather than participating. And she began reporting encounters in the between, describing things she met there in terms that mixed precise detail with incomprehensibility. She spoke of presences that were almost but not quite human-shaped, that communicated without language, that seemed intensely interested in her repeated crossings. She spoke of structures in the between, architecture that followed no physical laws, spaces that contained impossible geometries, rooms that opened onto vistas no living human should be able to perceive. Margaret listened to these reports and grew increasingly concerned. Abigail was progressing too quickly, spending too much time in the between, developing too much comfort with a realm that should remain alien. Margaret warned that familiarity with the between was dangerous, that the longer Abigail spent there, the more she would belong to it rather than to the living world. But Abigail insisted she needed to understand it completely, needed to map every corner of that landscape if she was going to safely navigate it for the rest of her life. By September of 1873, exactly 1 year after the incident that had exposed her condition to public scrutiny, Abigail had achieved remarkable control. She could cross into the between and return at will. She could spend up to 6 hours in that state, her body showing no vital signs, her consciousness exploring regions Margaret couldn't or wouldn't describe fully. But the cost was becoming apparent. Abigail no longer seemed fully present even when she was in her body. She moved through daily life as if it were a dream, something happening to someone else. Her father noticed. Margaret noticed, and they both recognized they were losing her, not to death but to something worse, to a state where death and life became indistinguishable and irrelevant. Margaret told Josiah it was time to end the training, that Abigail had learned as much as she could safely learn, that continuing would risk her becoming permanently caught between states, unable to fully inhabit either realm. Josiah agreed. He told Abigail the training was complete, that she needed to stop her deliberate crossings, needed to focus on staying grounded in the living world. Abigail listened calmly and said she would comply. She was lying. Through the fall and winter of 1873, Abigail continued her explorations of the between without telling her father or Margaret. She had become addicted to it, to the freedom of consciousness unbound by flesh, to the clarity she experienced in that liminal space. The living world seemed muddy and limited by comparison, constrained by physical law, by time's linear progression, by the demands of a body that required constant maintenance. In the between, she was pure awareness, able to perceive without the interference of sensory organs, able to move without the limitation of muscles and bones, and the presences she encountered there no longer frightened her. Some had become familiar, recognizable, almost companionable. She'd learned to communicate with them after a fashion, to understand that they were as curious about the living world as she was about theirs. They asked questions about embodiment, about what it felt like to be contained in flesh, about the experience of time as progression rather than simultaneity. And they offered knowledge in return, showing her aspects of the between she hadn't discovered herself, teaching her to navigate passages that led to other regions, other levels of that infinite landscape. It was in one of these deeper regions that Abigail encountered the thing that changed everything. She'd been exploring a section of the between that felt older, more fundamental than the areas she'd previously visited. The architecture here, if it could be called that, suggested incredible age, structures built by minds completely alien to human thought. And at the center of this region, she found a presence unlike anything she'd encountered before. It was massive, not in physical terms but in terms of awareness, consciousness at a scale that made Abigail feel like a mote of dust. This presence noticed her immediately. It examined her with interest that felt almost predatory, analyzing her nature, her origin, the fact that she straddled both living and between states. And then it communicated, not in images or feelings like the other presences, but in something closer to language, concepts that appeared directly in her mind. The presence said it had been waiting. It said that crossings like Abigail's were rare, that most who came to the between came because they died and had no choice, that conscious living visitors were precious. It said it had questions, needed information about the living world, had been trying to understand that realm for longer than human civilization had existed. And it offered a bargain, knowledge for knowledge, access for access. It would teach Abigail things no living human had ever known, would show her the deep truths of the between, the hidden structures of reality itself. In return, it wanted her to serve as a bridge, to allow it periodic access to her perceptions, her memories, her experiences of embodied life. Abigail, despite Margaret's warnings, despite her own instincts screaming that this was dangerous, accepted the bargain. The knowledge the presence offered was too vast, too tempting. She wanted to understand everything, to see reality from a perspective no other human had achieved. The presence accepted her agreement and immediately began fulfilling its side. It showed her the foundations of the between, explained that it wasn't a separate place but a substrate, a layer of reality that existed beneath and within all physical space, normally imperceptible but always present. It showed her how consciousness could persist without biological support, how awareness was a fundamental property of the universe rather than an emergent property of complex nervous systems. It showed her that death was transition, not ending, that what humans called life was a temporary stabilization of consciousness within flesh, and what they called death was simply consciousness returning to its natural state, diffused and unbound. The implications were staggering. If this was true, then everything humanity believed about existence was based on limited perception, on seeing only the surface of a reality far stranger and more profound than anyone imagined. Abigail absorbed this knowledge with joy that bordered on religious ecstasy. She felt she'd finally found truth, found meaning beyond the mundane concerns of embodied life. But the presence's side of the bargain had costs Abigail hadn't fully anticipated. Allowing it access to her perceptions meant it could see through her eyes when she was in the living world, could experience embodiment vicariously through her senses. At first, this seemed harmless, even beneficial, as if she were sharing her life with a fascinated observer. But the presence was hungry for experience. It wanted more than observation. It wanted to feel the weight of flesh, the limitation of linear time, the intensity of physical sensation. And it began pushing, testing the boundaries of their agreement, trying to move from passenger to driver. Abigail would find herself doing things she hadn't chosen to do, moving her body in ways that felt wrong, speaking words that weren't her thoughts. The presence apologized when she protested, said it was learning, said it didn't understand the protocols of inhabiting a living form. But the incidents continued and intensified. Abigail realized too late that she'd opened a door she couldn't close, that the presence had established a connection that grew stronger each time she crossed into the between, each time she allowed it access to her living experiences. By February of 1874, Abigail's family recognized something was profoundly wrong. She would speak in voices that weren't hers, express thoughts that were alien, move in ways that seemed to violate basic human physiology. Josiah confronted her, demanded to know what had happened. Abigail tried to explain about the presence, about the bargain she'd made, about the knowledge she'd gained and the price she was paying. Josiah was horrified. He'd spent his life protecting his daughter from the dangers of her condition, and she'd voluntarily invited something into herself, something that wanted to wear her body like clothing. He summoned Margaret Corvin, begged her to help, to find some way to sever the connection Abigail had established. Margaret listened to Abigail's account and went pale. She said that bargains made in the between were binding in ways physical contracts couldn't match, that they operated on levels of reality where human will had little leverage. The only way to break such a bargain was to die permanently, to cross into the between one final time and refuse to return, to surrender embodiment completely. But doing so meant Abigail's consciousness would be trapped in the between forever, subject to whatever the presence wanted to do with her. It was a choice between slow possession in the living world or eternal captivity in the liminal space. Abigail, hearing this, made a third choice. She decided to kill the presence. Margaret said this was impossible, that presences in the between couldn't die because they'd never been alive, that they were aspects of the between itself, no more killable than gravity or time. But Abigail had learned things during her explorations, had discovered that while presences couldn't be destroyed, they could be contained, trapped in regions of the between from which they couldn't escape. The process required knowledge of the between's architecture, required using its own structures against it, required someone willing to enter the deepest regions and perform a kind of surgery on reality itself. It was dangerous beyond measure. Most who attempted such things were lost, their consciousness shattered, scattered across the between in fragments that couldn't reassemble. But Abigail said it was the only option. She couldn't live with the presence slowly consuming her identity. She couldn't die and leave it free to potentially establish connections with other humans who crossed into the between. She had to try containment, regardless of the risk. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Abigail spent 3 weeks preparing for the attempt. Margaret taught her everything she knew about the deep regions of the between, about the structures that existed there, about how to navigate spaces where human consciousness wasn't meant to function. Josiah, knowing he might lose his daughter, made his peace with that possibility and gave her his blessing. On the night of March 19, 1874, during the dark of the moon, Abigail descended into the between one final time. Her body ceased all vital function at 10 minutes past midnight. Josiah and Margaret sat vigil beside her, waiting, hopping, unable to do anything but bear witness. The hours passed. Midnight became dawn. Dawn became noon. Noon became afternoon. Still no change. Abigail remained dead, her body cooling, beginning to show signs of true mortality. Margaret said they had to prepare for burial, that Abigail had been gone too long, that something must have gone wrong in the deep between. But Josiah refused. He said they would wait. They would give her every possible moment to return. What happened in the between during those hours, we know only from Abigail's later account, recorded in a journal she kept in the final months of her life. She wrote that descending into the deep regions was like falling through layers of reality, each one stranger than the last, until she reached areas where human concepts completely failed. The presence was waiting for her there. It had known she would come. It had anticipated her plan, and it was angry, not with the emotion humans experience, but with something colder, more fundamental, the fury of a cosmic principle being violated. The presence said that Abigail belonged to it now, that the bargain couldn't be broken, that attempting containment would destroy them both. Abigail said she accepted that cost, better mutual destruction than continued violation. She began the process Margaret had taught her, using her own consciousness as a lure, drawing the presence deeper into the between's architecture, leading it toward a region that functioned as a kind of trap, a loop of space that fed back into itself with no exit. The presence fought, tried to sever its connection to Abigail, tried to retreat to safer regions. But Abigail held on, maintained the link, pulled it forward even as she felt herself fragmenting under the strain. The final moment, Abigail wrote, felt like being torn apart and compressed simultaneously, like every atom of her awareness was being pulled in different directions while being crushed into a single point. She felt the presence scream, not with sound, but with a vibration that propagated through all levels of reality. She felt the trap close, felt the presence locked into its loop, contained but not destroyed, imprisoned in a region where it could no longer reach the living world. And then she felt herself falling backward, returning through the layers of the between faster than she'd descended, pulled by something she didn't recognize, something that wasn't her will or the presence's but a third force, something that wanted her back in the living world for reasons she couldn't determine. She remembered breaking surface, remembered the shock of re-inhabiting her body, remembered pain unlike anything she'd experienced, the agony of consciousness being forced back into flesh that had begun the process of death. She opened her eyes at 6:07 in the evening, 18 hours and 7 minutes after she'd crossed into the between. Josiah and Margaret, who'd remained at vigil despite their exhaustion, both started at her sudden gasp. They examined her frantically, found her heart beating, found her breathing, found her alive against all probability. But they also found her changed. Abigail's eyes held a quality they'd never had before, a distance that suggested she was looking at the living world from very far away. She spoke, but her voice was rough, damaged, as if vocal cords that had been still too long were struggling to remember their function. She said she'd done it. She'd contained the presence. But she also said the cost was higher than she'd expected. Part of her had been left behind in the between. Not trapped like the presence, but lost, scattered across those deep regions, unretrievable. She was incomplete now, functioning but diminished, a person with pieces missing that could never be recovered. The months following Abigail's return were marked by steady decline. Physically she was healthy, but psychologically she was fragmenting. She would speak about things that hadn't happened, mix memories from her life with experiences from the between, lose track of which realm she was inhabiting. Josiah tried to care for her, tried to keep her grounded, but Abigail was slipping away, not into the between but into some space between sanity and absence. Margaret visited regularly, tried to help, but admitted she'd never seen anyone return from such a deep descent, had no framework for treating injuries sustained in regions of reality that shouldn't be accessible to living consciousness. By August, Abigail was barely verbal. She would sit for hours without moving, staring at nothing, occasionally speaking in fragments about places she'd been, things she'd seen, warning about dangers that made no sense to anyone listening. Dr. Whitcomb, who'd maintained sporadic contact with the family since Abigail's exposure, came to examine her at Josiah's request. He found her physiologically perfect but psychologically unreachable, as if the essential quality that made her Abigail had been hollowed out, leaving only biological function. Abigail died on November 2, 1874. Her heart simply stopped during the night. No episode, no transition, just cessation. Josiah found her in the morning, peaceful, finally at rest. The funeral was private, family only, held on the Marsh property. They buried her in the family plot next to her mother, marked her grave with a simple stone bearing her name and dates and nothing else. Dr. Whitcomb attended and noted in his journal that he'd witnessed many deaths during his career, but none that felt like such a relief, as if Abigail's passing released some tension that had been building for years. Margaret Corvin left Alabama the week after the funeral and returned to Tennessee. She told Josiah before leaving that Abigail's story should serve as warning to any family members who inherited the condition, that the between was not meant to be explored, that some boundaries exist for good reasons, and crossing them comes with costs no one should be willing to pay. The Marsh family gradually faded from public attention. Josiah died in 1896. His surviving son inherited the property, and the peculiarities that had marked the family were either bred out through marriage to outsiders or suppressed through the kind of determined normalcy that trauma survivors often pursue. Dr. Whitcomb's papers on Abigail's case were never widely distributed, relegated to medical archives where they gathered dust, occasionally discovered by researchers who dismissed them as either misdiagnosed catalepsy or elaborate hoax. The Mobile Daily Register's sensational articles about the impossible woman were forgotten, buried in the vast accumulation of 19th-century journalism that no one would read again, until historians began digitizing newspaper archives more than a century later. By the 1920s, no one in southern Alabama remembered Abigail Marsh Whitmore except as a vague local legend, the woman who supposedly died and came back, a story parents might tell children to explain why they shouldn't mess with things they didn't understand. But the Between remembers. That's what Abigail wrote in the final entry of her journal, dated October 1874, 2 weeks before her death. She wrote that places like the Between don't forget, that consciousness leaves traces wherever it travels, that she'd marked that realm with her presence in ways she hadn't intended. She wrote that she sometimes felt she was being watched from the other side, that presences she'd encountered during her crossings were aware of her even when she was fully in the living world, that the boundary she'd spent so much time traversing had become permeable in ways that wouldn't reverse. And she wrote a warning for anyone who might inherit her condition, anyone who might find themselves capable of dying and returning. She said to resist the temptation to explore, to accept the affliction as burden rather than gift, to cross only when necessary and return as quickly as possible. She said the Between was patient, that it had existed long before humanity and would exist long after, that it watched the living world with interest that was neither benevolent nor malevolent but profoundly alien, that catching its attention was dangerous in ways that couldn't be adequately described in human language. She said she'd made the mistake of believing she could understand it, could master it, could bargain with it as if it operated on human terms. And she'd learned too late that the Between operated on its own terms, that it took what it wanted from those who ventured into it, and that sometimes what it wanted was everything. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The question that Abigail's story leaves us with isn't whether the Between exists. The documented evidence of her episodes, witnessed by multiple credible observers including trained physicians, makes the reality of her condition undeniable even if the explanation remains elusive. The question is whether others like her exist now, walking among us with the capacity to die and return, struggling with an affliction that medical science still can't explain, keeping their condition secret because exposure would destroy their lives as surely as it destroyed Abigail's. And if they do exist, if there are people born with the ability to cross into spaces between life and death, what are they seeing there? What are they encountering? And more disturbingly, what are they bringing back with them, consciously or unconsciously, from realms that human consciousness was never meant to access? Abigail managed to contain the presence she'd bargained with, trapped it in the deep structures of the Between where it could no longer reach the living world. But her journal suggests there were other presences, countless others, watching and waiting and endlessly curious about the world of flesh and linear time. How many of them have found ways to establish connections with living humans? How many people walking through daily life are carrying passengers, hosting awarenesses that experience embodiment vicariously through human senses, learning about our world through observations we don't even know we're providing? The medical community, when confronted with Abigail's case in the rare instances when it's discussed, defaults to rational explanations. Catalepsy, trance states, psychogenic cardiac arrest, conditions where vital signs become so depressed they're undetectable by 19th-century medical instruments. These explanations provide comfort, allow us to believe that Abigail's episodes fit within understood physiological frameworks, that nothing truly impossible occurred. But Dr. Whitcomb was a capable physician using the best available methods of his era. He knew how to detect a pulse, how to assess breathing, how to distinguish between depressed vital signs and complete cessation. And he documented with meticulous precision that Abigail had no heartbeat for 2 hours, no respiration, no physiological signs of life whatsoever. For her condition to be explained purely through conventional medicine, we'd have to believe Whitcomb and his colleagues were all incompetent or deluded. The simpler explanation, the more disturbing explanation, is that they accurately observed something that shouldn't be possible, something that reveals fundamental gaps in our understanding of consciousness, death, and the relationship between them. The final mystery of Abigail Marsh Whitmore isn't what happened to her. We know she died in 1874, worn out by her explorations of the between, broken by the cost of containing the presence she'd bargained with. The mystery is what happened to the pieces of consciousness she said she'd lost in the deep regions during that final descent. She wrote that part of her was scattered across the between, fragments of awareness separated from her primary consciousness, unable to reunite with her living form. Those fragments, if they existed, would still be there now, drifting through the between, carrying memories of embodied life, perhaps still carrying something of Abigail's identity. And if consciousness can persist without biological support, if awareness is as fundamental as the presence suggested, then those fragments might still be aware, still experiencing something, trapped in a realm where time moves differently, where 150 years might feel like moments or millennia. Sometimes, late at night, researchers studying Abigail's case report strange dreams, dreams of drifting through spaces that follow no physical laws, dreams of encountering a presence that feels feminine and lost and desperately trying to communicate something important. These dreams are easy to dismiss as suggestion, as the mind processing disturbing material during sleep. But they're consistent across multiple researchers who have studied the case independently, people who have never met but who report remarkably similar experiences. It's as if something in the between is still reaching out, still trying to make contact, still carrying traces of the woman who explored too deeply and paid the ultimate price for her curiosity. And that possibility, that fragments of Abigail Marsh might still exist in some form, still aware, still suffering, trapped in a realm we can barely conceive of, might be the most haunting aspect of her story, the question that can never be answered, the ghost that can never truly be laid to rest.